Some stories begin with ambition, others begin with betrayal. This one begins with something far more disturbing, a body that refused to die. In the early hours of a cold New York morning, a man was dragged out of a car, beaten until unrecognizable, stabbed again and again, and left in a roadside ditch to bleed out in the dark. Whoever did it didn't hurry. They didn't panic. They worked carefully, methodically, as if they were erasing a problem forever. When they were finished, they walked away, convinced there was nothing left to fear. They were wrong. The man in that ditch was Lucky Luciano. Not yet a legend, not yet untouchable, but already dangerous enough that the most powerful figures in New York wanted him erased in the most final way possible. This wasn't a warning. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution meant to end an idea, not just a life. What happened next defied logic, medicine, and every rule of the underworld. Against all expectations, Luciano survived, and that survival did more than save his life. It changed his trajectory, hardened his resolve, and transformed him from a rising figure into an inevitable one. From that moment on, the old Mafia system had a problem it could no longer solve with knives or intimidation. Because when you try to kill a man and fail, you don't return to the way things were. You create something new. You create someone who understands that mercy is wasted, hesitation is fatal, and power belongs to those who outlive their enemies long enough to redesign the game. This isn't just the story of a brutal attack. It's the story of a rebirth. The night a man should have died, and the moment the old Mafia began to lose its grip on the future. New York in 1929 wasn't held together by law or loyalty. It was held together by momentum, the constant forward motion of violence that nobody knew how to stop. Prohibition had flooded the city with money, but there was no system to control it. Every neighborhood was contested. Every alliance was temporary. Every insult carried the potential to become a war. At the top of this chaos stood men who believed power had only one language. Joe Masseria ruled through fear and tradition, enforcing obedience the way it had always been done. Intimidation first, punishment second, explanation never. His rival, Salvatore Maranzano, believed even more rigidly in hierarchy. One boss, absolute authority, no debate, no equality. The old Sicilian order transplanted onto American streets. Caught between them was a younger generation that didn't share their patience for endless bloodshed. Men who had grown up in New York, not Sicily. Men who understood that prohibition wasn't a feud, it was an economy. And at the center of that thinking stood Lucky Luciano. Luciano wasn't the most violent man in the room. He didn't need to be. What set him apart was his refusal to accept chaos as inevitable. He watched crews destroy themselves over pride while profits leaked through their fingers. He watched bosses cling to titles while their soldiers died for disputes that no longer mattered. And quietly, he began imagining something dangerous. A structure where power was shared, disputes were managed, and violence was controlled instead of celebrated. To the old bosses, this wasn't innovation, it was contamination. Luciano's ideas didn't challenge one man's authority. They threatened the entire logic of how power worked. If loyalty was no longer enforced through fear, then fear lost its value. And if fear lost its value, men like Masseria and Maranzano lost everything. By the fall of 1929, that tension had become unsustainable. The city was already on edge from internal wars, and whispers about reform only sharpened suspicion. Luciano wasn't openly rebelling, but that made him more dangerous. He was building influence without asking permission, drawing loyalty without demanding it. And that kind of power couldn't be confronted publicly without exposing weakness. So, the decision was made quietly. No warnings, no negotiations, no second chances. If the problem couldn't be controlled, it would be removed. The mistake wasn't trying to kill Luciano. The mistake was believing that killing him would be enough. Men who survive the underworld learn to recognize danger long before it announces itself. A look held too long, a voice that skips formalities, a meeting that doesn't come through the usual channels. On that night, Lucky Luciano noticed all of it and understood exactly what kind of ride he was being offered. The men who approached him didn't act rushed. They didn't raise their voices or draw unnecessary attention. That alone told Luciano this wasn't a street-level problem. Street violence was loud, chaotic, and impatient. This was controlled, planned, the kind of move ordered from above, where mistakes weren't tolerated and witnesses weren't part of the design. Luciano had a choice, but it wasn't the one people imagine. Fighting back in the open would have guaranteed a faster end. Running would have turned him into a moving target. He knew the math instantly. Outnumbered, boxed in, no allies close enough to matter. The smartest move wasn't resistance, it was observation. As the car pulled away from familiar streets, the direction confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't about interrogation or negotiation. No one kidnaps a man to talk when they intend to let him walk away. The destination mattered less than the intent. Wherever they were going, it wasn't somewhere he was expected to leave. What separated Luciano from countless others who had vanished before him was not courage, but discipline. Panic wastes energy. Anger clouds timing. Luciano focused on details instead: the number of men, their confidence, the absence of conversation. Professionals don't explain themselves, they execute. This calm wasn't denial, it was calculation. If there was any chance, however small, it wouldn't come from defiance. It would come from endurance, from surviving long enough for circumstances to shift. In the underworld, time is often the only ally a condemned man has left. By the time the car reached isolation, Luciano no longer hoped for escape. Hope wasn't useful. What mattered was control over the one thing still his: information. He would give them nothing they didn't already believe they had. No names, no confirmation, no satisfaction. If this was the end, he would make it expensive. This moment marked the real divide between the man Luciano had been and the one he was becoming. The younger version believed power came from alliances and ideas. The man stepping out of that car understood something harsher. Before you can change the system, you must survive the people who benefit from it. And survival, in that world, often begins by knowing when not to fight. What happened next was meant to be final, not symbolic, not instructional, final. The men who surrounded Lucky Luciano weren't improvising or acting on emotion. This wasn't a beating meant to scare him straight or send him limping back with a warning. It was an erasure. In the old Mafia logic, problems like Luciano didn't get negotiated with, they were removed completely. And yet, this was where that logic failed. The violence itself followed an outdated assumption that once enough damage is done, the outcome becomes guaranteed. That fear, pain, and physical destruction inevitably end resistance. It was the same thinking that had governed the underworld for decades. If someone survives the first blow, you hit harder until they don't. No contingency, no alternative ending. But survival doesn't always announce itself in the moment. Sometimes it hides in sheer refusal. Not heroism, not strength. Just a stubborn, irrational resistance to disappearing on someone else's terms. Hours later, when daylight began to erase the secrecy of the night, the assumption of certainty collapsed. A body that should have been inert wasn't. Breath hadn't stopped. Life hadn't signed off. And in that quiet discovery, something far more dangerous than a failed execution emerged. Uncertainty. For the underworld, this wasn't just a mistake. It was a conceptual problem. The rules had no answer for this outcome. There was no protocol for "he should be dead, but isn't." Violence is effective only when it produces predictable results. The moment it doesn't, authority starts to wobble. Luciano's survival spread fast, not as rumor, but as disbelief. Men who had accepted his removal as inevitable suddenly realized they were standing in a vacuum. Orders had been given, lines crossed, and the intended result hadn't materialized. That left only consequences. What made this moment decisive wasn't what Luciano did next, it was what he didn't do. There was no immediate retaliation, no declaration, no demand for sympathy or recognition. He didn't try to leverage the attack for status. He disappeared from sight, from conversation, from immediate calculations. And that absence forced everyone else to imagine the worst. In criminal hierarchies, silence after violence is never comforting. It suggests preparation. It suggests memory. It suggests that whatever comes next won't be reactive, it will be designed. That night marked the end of Luciano as a rising figure and the beginning of something more dangerous. He wasn't just a man who survived an attempt on his life. He became a variable the old system could no longer control or predict. And when a system built on certainty loses the ability to predict outcomes, it doesn't adapt, it collapses. Surviving wasn't the victory. What came after survival was where power was decided. For weeks, Lucky Luciano remained out of sight. No statements, no public appearances, no attempts to reclaim status or demand loyalty. In a world where reputation was usually rebuilt through retaliation, this restraint felt unnatural, and that made it terrifying. Men who expected chaos were met with nothing, and nothing, in the underworld, invites imagination. Luciano understood the danger of moving too soon. Violence had failed once, and that failure created space. Space for rumors, space for doubt, space for recalculation. If he rushed to answer the attack with blood, he would only confirm the old rules still worked. Instead, he let uncertainty do the work for him. Behind the scenes, recovery wasn't just physical, it was strategic. Luciano reassessed every relationship, every alliance, every silence during his disappearance. Survival sharpens memory. He now knew who benefited from his removal, who stayed neutral, and who quietly waited. Information gathered during vulnerability is always the most honest kind. At the center of this recalibration was Meyer Lansky, whose role wasn't emotional support, but structure. Together, they treated the failed execution not as a near ending, but as proof that the old system couldn't tolerate reform. Proof that coexistence with the old bosses was impossible, and proof that whatever came next had to be decisive, not loud. Luciano didn't announce a comeback. He allowed others to discover it indirectly. Meetings resumed without his name being spoken, yet decisions increasingly aligned with his thinking. Crews once divided by tradition began cooperating quietly. Money moved more smoothly. Violence slowed not out of mercy, but because disorder had become inefficient. This phase mattered more than any later assassination. It was here that Luciano stopped thinking like a challenger and began thinking like an architect. He wasn't trying to win a feud. He was designing a replacement, one where authority didn't depend on titles or ancestry, but on coordination and predictability. The men who had tried to erase him believed survival would make him reckless. Instead, it made him precise. They expected revenge. What they got was irrelevance. Their methods no longer fit the environment Luciano was shaping. By the time his enemies realized he was no longer reacting to them, but planning beyond them, the balance had already shifted. Survival had given Luciano something no title ever could: the clarity to dismantle the past without confronting it head-on. And once the old order stopped being necessary, its collapse became only a matter of time. The collapse of the old order didn't happen in a single night. It unfolded through decisions that looked ordinary on the surface and irreversible in hindsight. Lucky Luciano didn't present himself as a conqueror returning from the dead. He positioned himself as something far more unsettling to his rivals, the inevitable outcome of their own failures. By this point, the internal war had exhausted everyone. Money was being lost, attention was increasing, allies were unreliable. The old bosses still believed they were fighting over dominance, but Luciano understood the fight was no longer about winning, it was about ending the game they were playing altogether. As long as the system remained intact, violence would keep reproducing itself. The first pillar to fall was Joe Masseria. His authority had weakened not because he lacked firepower, but because he couldn't adapt. Loyalty around him had become transactional, not ideological. Luciano didn't challenge him directly. He allowed Masseria to believe control still existed, even as the ground quietly shifted underneath it. When the moment came, Luciano made sure he wasn't the one visibly holding the weapon. Distance mattered. Plausible separation mattered. Power, once again, was exercised without proximity. With Masseria gone, the old system briefly believed it had won. Salvatore Maranzano declared dominance and attempted to formalize absolute authority. It was the final expression of a dying philosophy hierarchy enforced from the top, descent erased at the bottom. Luciano recognized it immediately. This wasn't stability, it was consolidation before collapse. Maranzano made the same mistake as before, assuming control could be maintained through intimidation alone. He didn't realize the environment had already changed. The men around him no longer feared the title he claimed. They feared the uncertainty Luciano represented. And fear, when it shifts direction, doesn't need instructions. When Maranzano was removed, it wasn't framed as revenge. It was treated as cleanup. The removal of a structure that no longer served anyone's interests. With both pillars of the old order gone, there was no vacuum because Luciano had already prepared what would replace them. What followed wasn't a coronation. There was no boss of bosses. Instead, Luciano introduced something radical for its time: shared authority, negotiated boundaries, and conflict resolution without constant bloodshed. The commission wasn't born out of mercy. It was born out of logic. Violence had proven too expensive. Chaos, too unpredictable. Luciano didn't rise above the system. He redesigned it, and the man who once lay forgotten in a ditch became the architect of an underworld that would outlive him by decades, not because he was lucky, but because he learned exactly how power survives when brute force no longer works. History likes clean endings: a killing, a victory, a clear winner standing over the fallen. But what happened to Lucky Luciano didn't fit that pattern, and that's exactly why it mattered. The night he was left for dead should have erased him. Instead, it stripped him down to something far more dangerous than a survivor driven by revenge. Luciano didn't come back looking to prove toughness. He came back understanding a deeper truth. Violence alone cannot hold power together. It can silence enemies, but it can't stabilize a system. And any system built only on fear eventually turns on itself. The men who tried to kill him believed survival would make him reckless. That pain would sharpen his temper, that humiliation would demand blood in return. They misread him completely. Survival didn't make Luciano louder, it made him precise. It clarified who needed to be removed, which ideas were obsolete, and what kind of structure could actually last. By the time the dust settled, the old Mafia world hadn't just lost its leaders, it had lost its logic. Absolute authority collapsed. Endless vendettas lost their purpose. In their place stood something colder, quieter, and far more resilient, an organization designed to minimize chaos, not glorify it. That's the real legacy of that night. Not the wounds, not the miracle of survival, but the transformation that followed. Luciano didn't defeat death and return unchanged. He let death reshape him into someone capable of ending an entire era. Some men survive attempts on their lives and spend the rest of their days looking over their shoulders. Luciano survived and made everyone else do the looking instead. Because in the end, the lesson wasn't about luck. It was about adaptation. And the most dangerous people aren't the ones who survive violence. They're the ones who learn from it.